Hey, what's up guys? I'm BTC. The Mercy changes have been on the PTR for a little while now, and I've gotten some good experience with the characters since they made the changes. Now, I already made a couple of videos showing off how her new abilities work, and also some just raw gameplay of the character. If you want to check out any of that, there'll be some links down below. So I want to talk about where Mercy is, like just how good or bad are these changes that they made to her. Because if you look in any of the comment section of my previous videos or on the official Overwatch forums, you'll see that half the people seem to be saying that these changes make Mercy so unbelievably overpowered, it's broken and they're too strong. And then the other half are saying that now she's completely garbage and this is the worst thing ever and nobody's ever gonna play her again. So obviously, both of those things can't be true at the same time. Now, in fairness, this kind of stuff does seem to happen every time a character goes through any sort of major changes. And I think one of the main reasons why this sort of happens is because people tend to talk about a character in terms of all of the Overwatch players, instead of breaking it up into categories. There is a significant difference between the average player on the competitive ladder and then a top 500 or a pro player in a tournament. They're two very, very different things. A perfect example is Torbjorn, who can be really strong at the lower skill brackets, but gets incredibly weak or almost worthless in the very high skill brackets. So first of all, where is the current version of Mercy in terms of pick rate? Because that's going to give us a pretty good idea of how good she is across the different skill levels. So if you look at this, you'll see that Mercy is the most played character overall. For Bronze through Diamond, she's in the #1 spot. Once you hit Master, it starts to drop though. She now is in the 2nd spot. And for GM and top 500, Mercy actually drops quite a bit. She is the least played support in the game for GM and top 500 and for the pro level of play. So right there, that should tell you for the average player, Mercy's pretty good. For the high skill, current version, not so good. Alright, so let's kind of talk about how the old Mercy compares to the new Mercy and how this is going to affect the average player and the high level pro player differently. So first up is basically your general play style. What used to happen on old Mercy is you would heal your team as much as you could, and then you would just hide. You would leave the fight and you would hide somewhere and wait for your team to die, and then you would swoop in and res, and hopefully that would be enough of a swing to actually take the fight and either defend the point or capture it or whatever. So the main problem with that strategy was that you were giving the enemy team an advantage. They had an extra player in the fight. You voluntarily took one of your characters and just said, don't participate in this fight for the majority of it and wait until everybody's dead, and then you can participate. And because of that, the enemy team had 6 and you only had 5, and usually in big Overwatch fights, whichever team has more players tends to win. Now, yeah, there are some situations where a McCree or something just goes, like, off and just gets, like, a whole bunch of kills in a row, but for the most part, the numbers wins. And what ends up happening with that is it's kind of this compounding problem, right? So it's 5 versus 6 because your Mercy isn't in the fight, and then you lose another one. So it's 4 versus 6, and then 3 versus 6, and then 2, and then 1, and then your Mercy comes in. And every time someone on your team dies, it makes it that much more difficult for the rest of your team to actually be effective. Because in most situations, unless there's a bunch of ultimates involved, the rest of your team is not going to die simultaneously. They're going to have one person die, and then a couple seconds later someone else dies, and then a couple seconds later someone else dies. So this downtime in between when people are dying, your team is at more and more of a disadvantage over and over. So after the last person on your team dies, the Mercy comes in, reses everybody, and then the fight basically starts all over again. Except now, your Mercy can actually participate in the fight, so it's a 6 versus 6, like it should have been in the beginning. And really how effective that big res is kind of all boils down to how disorganized is the enemy team. If they're really disorganized, like what usually happens on the competitive ladder with the average player, then what's going to happen is they're going to use a whole bunch of their ultimates, like a Reaper ult or a Pharah ult, all at the same time, in order to get that first team wipe. So then when you swoop in and you res everybody, they now have nothing left to mop up those rezzed characters. But the higher skill players in the Grandmaster, Top 500, and in the pro level of play, more than just knowing not to do that, they're also organized enough to communicate and to make sure that it never happens. So the high skill players would burn the Reaper ult to kill the team the first time, and as soon as Mercy reses them, they're going to get hit with that Pharah ult, and they're going to get wiped a second time. So here's the thing though, there are still some high skill and pro players that use Mercy and her ultimate in its current form, with the Resurrect. They just use it in a different way than the average player does. Rather than waiting for the rest of your team to die and then swoop in and get a big res, they do what's called a tempo res, which is when 2 or 3, sometimes even only 1 of your teammates are dead, and their Mercy will pop the res and bring them back to life. And the reason for this is because it's the war of the numbers, kind of like what I was talking about earlier. This also has something in common with why you don't attack a point in a kind of staggered fashion. Like, you don't want 2 people going in, and then another 2, and another 2, or 3 here. You want all 6 of your team alive and pushing the capture point because it gives you the best chance to win. And when you're in the middle of that fight, let's say 2 people from each team die. It's now 4 versus 4. Well, that Mercy can do a quick tempo res, bring back 2 people, and all of a sudden it's 6 versus 4, and you have a massive advantage. Now, sometimes, like I said, it's not even 2 or 3, it's just 1. It might be a tank, it might be your main DPS, it's someone that's going to have a massive impact on the fight, and that is what the high skill players, more often than not, are using the res for. It's those tempo plays. So that brings us to the new version of Mercy, which is built all around these sorts of tempo plays. The new Mercy is the undisputed god of tempo in Overwatch. So rather than forcing your team into a disadvantaged position by forcing the 5 versus 6, which then gets turned into a 4 versus 6, 3 versus 6, that sort of deal, you now have 6 versus 6. And as soon as somebody on your team dies, Mercy can instantly resurrect them and bring it back to 6 versus 6 again. That is amazing healing potential. That is incredible tempo potential, because think of it this way. You are instantly healing someone to full health. Now, if it's just a DPS or something, that's 200 health instantly. If it's a tank, you're talking 400 to 500 health instantly brought back. And what happens if someone else dies? Well, then you can just pop your ult, res another person, and it's once again still 6 versus 6. And then if somebody else dies, you can res them again after 10 seconds. Like, the tempo potential, the control potential that Mercy has with this new Resurrect and the new Ultimate is just insane for people who know how to use it. So these changes drastically raise the skill ceiling of Mercy, and it's going to be a massive buff for high skill and pro players. Now, I don't think this is going to be overpowered. I don't think it's going to be a must pick, but she is definitely going to see a lot more use, and it's actually going to allow Mercy to compete with Lucio, Zenyatta, and Ana. Bringing Mercy up to the point where she can actually compete with the other healers is going to significantly increase the variety of the hero picks at the high level of play. It's going to allow for a lot more interesting combinations and should help battle the kind of stale meta that seems to stall out the game quite often. Now, that's all fine and good for the high skill and the pros, but what about the average player? How are these changes going to affect the random average Mercy player on the competitive ladder? Well, I'm not gonna lie, at first this is going to seem like a pretty big nerf. First of all, they're going to have to adjust to a completely different playstyle, which is going to be more difficult for them because, again, we're talking the average player instead of a pro player who just spends hours and hours and hours practicing all this stuff. Now, overall, just because it feels like a nerf doesn't mean there aren't going to be some advantages even for the average player. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that your teams are gonna be disorganized. And the new version of Mercy can actually help you kind of counteract that. So I'm sure you've seen it many, many times where the Mercy on your team gets the Resurrect Ultimate. and tells everybody, hey, I have my ult, everybody needs to go in and attack at the same time, die on the point, die on the cart, something, whatever, and then not everybody does it. Only like half the team goes in. And some of your team is like way off over there. So when you're ready to actually use your res, you only get like 2 or 3 people because your team is so spread out. So even when you're waiting for those really big reses, your team isn't always going to be cooperative with you to allow you to get it. Following that line of thought, the resurrect change also helps you deal with that general stupidity you might find in some of your teammates. So you have that teammate who decides to run ahead of the tanks and he just gets mowed down. Well, now you can just instantly res him and he's back in the fight. Or you have that other teammate who is like grossly out of position all the time and normally he's just going to get killed instantly. Well, if he does, you can now res him and again, he's back in the fight. So it's not going to eliminate the general stupidity and bad play of your teammates. It's going to really help you counteract some of it. Another thing to consider is that the average player on Soldier 76 or McCree generally has kind of a tough time killing a Mercy who's just slowly floating through the air as she's healing and damage amping a Pharah. Now imagine that same Mercy who is ulted and now has full flight and is moving around insanely fast, just kind of like zipping around through the air. The average player on Soldier 76 and McCree on the enemy team is not going to be able to kill her. She is basically just going to fly around and heal or damage amp anyone she wants because remember, the range on the beam practically goes across the map once she's in her ult form. So she's going to be able to zip around all around up top there, heal and damage amp everybody she wants to, and the enemy team really isn't going to be able to do a whole lot about it. Not to mention the fact that when she is in her ultimate, not only can she fly around, but she also has that constant regeneration even while she's taking damage. So it makes it even more difficult for that average player on the enemy team to actually shoot her out of the sky. Alright, so let's cut to the brass tacks. Is the new version of Mercy overpowered? Is she complete garbage? How does it compare to the old version? Well, for the average player, at first, it's going to feel like a nerf. No question, it's going to feel like a nerf because you're going to have to completely change how you play the game. But for the people that figure out how to play the new version of Mercy, I think overall they're going to find that it's going to be a buff and it's a good change. For the people that refuse to accept the new version of Mercy and they keep trying to play it the old way, then they're going to have a lot of problems and they're just going to feel like it's a nerf forever and ever and ever. Now, for the high skill and the pro players, this is a massive improvement to the character. Is she overpowered? No. She is definitely not. She's just in a really good spot compared to the other healers now. I do believe, however, Blizzard has said that they felt her blaster damage in the ultimate was too strong and they're going to nerf that a little bit. But other than that, I think the character is going to be in a really good place. It's not overpowered. It's not garbage. It is going to take a different play style from the average player who are just not used to it. But again, once they get used to it, I think they're going to like it. So what do you guys think about all this? Let me know down in the comment section. Also, don't forget to check out my Discord server, follow me on Twitter, and subscribe so you don't miss any of the new awesome content. Thanks for watching. Remember, always blame the controller because it's never your fault. Also, special thanks to all my Patreon supporters for helping to make this all possible. If you'd like to see what kind of cool rewards you can get for supporting the channel, check the links on screen and down below.